You couldn't even afford a bus fare." Those were the exact words my son Spencer yelled at me in front of his architect colleagues, right there at the entrance of his new two-story house in the upscale Greystone Manor development. I had just arrived from work, my clothes stained with mortar and my old boots begging for mercy, asking him to lend me $5 for the bus ride home. He, in his designer suit and shiny black BMW, looked at me with disgust and spat out that phrase like a knife blade. His friends laughed. I pretended not to care. I smiled at them all and walked away into the pouring rain. What my son didn't know was that those same calloused hands he despised had built half of Oakwood Springs, North Carolina, over the course of 40 years. And that same night, while he celebrated with his friends, I was signing the papers to buy his precious home. Before I tell you how I managed to teach him the biggest lesson of his life, know that what happened that evening changed our family forever. My name is Charles Dixon, though most folks call me Chuck, and this is the story of how a seemingly useless old man showed his successful son who the truly worthless one was. It was 11:30 at night when I arrived at the office of attorney James Holloway, carrying an old leather briefcase that had belonged to my father. The rain was still falling heavily on the historic downtown streets of Oakwood Springs, and my work boots echoed in the empty hallway of the brick office building where he had his practice. I knocked on the door 3 times, as we had agreed on the phone. "Come in, Chuck," I heard his low, rough voice from inside. Attorney Holloway was a man in his 72s with a white mustache and thick glasses who had known me since I was an 8-year-old boy working on the construction of his first house. Now, 58 years later, I was there to conduct the most important business deal of my life. His office smelled of tobacco and old legal books, with shelves crammed full of civil codes and yellowed case files. On the wall hung his law degree, dated from 1975. The same year, I built my first house to sell. "Did you bring everything?" he asked, switching on his desk lamp. Without a word, I placed the briefcase on his mahogany desk and opened it. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, all perfectly organized with red rubber bands, and counted 3 times that afternoon in the solitude of my room. It was $560,000 exactly, the price my son had paid for his house just 6 months prior. Attorney Holloway let out a low whistle when he saw the money. "Chuck, in all my years as an attorney, I've never seen someone pay cash for an entire house this late at night," he said, pulling documents from his portfolio. "Are you completely sure about this? It's a considerable amount. And besides, it's your son." I took the papers and reviewed them line by line. Everything was there. The original deed, the recent appraisal, the current property tax payments, the public registry signatures. Spencer's house, the very one where he had humiliated me only 5 hours earlier, was now about to have a new owner. "Counselor," I said, pulling out my blue ink pen, the same one I used to sign construction contracts. "There are things a father has to do to teach his children a lesson, and my son needs to learn that respect isn't bought with college degrees or new cars." The attorney nodded slowly and showed me where to sign. "Charles Dixon." I wrote my name in clear script on every page, every copy, every document that would make the transfer official. While I signed, Jim told me how he'd gotten the details about Spencer's mortgage. "Your son is 3 payments behind to the bank, Chuck. He's in the red. If he doesn't pay within the next 15 days, the bank will seize the house." That information hurt me more than his insults. That afternoon, my son, the successful architect who bragged about his BMW and expensive suits, was bankrupt and had never once asked me for help. He preferred to humiliate me rather than admit he needed his father. When I finished signing, the attorney sealed each document with his official stamp and locked them in his safe. "I'll go to the public registry first thing in the morning," he said. "By the afternoon, you will legally be the owner of your son's house." I put the remaining money back in the briefcase, shook his hand, and walked out into the rain. Walking back to my small, humble house, my boots sloshing through the puddles, I thought about the look on Spencer's face when he found out. 40 years saving every dime. 40 years investing in cheap land that later became residential developments. 40 years building homes for others while living in the same modest house where I was born. And the moment had finally arrived to use that invisible fortune My son Spencer was always different from the other boys in the neighborhood. From a young age, he liked to draw houses instead of playing basketball at the park. When he turned 18, he told me he wanted to study architecture at a major university. "Dad, I don't want to be a bricklayer like you," he told me one afternoon as I returned from work covered in dust and mortar. "I want to design buildings, not build them with my hands." His words stung at the time, but I figured it was normal. Sons always want to be better than their fathers, and I had worked my whole life so he could have that opportunity. I sold 3 parcels of land I had bought in the 1,970 and paid for his entire education, 5 years of university, 5 years during which I ate rice and beans to save every dollar he needed for books, materials, and projects. When he graduated, I watched him at the ceremony in his cap and gown, and my chest swelled with pride. My son, the architect. It was all worth it, I thought. But something changed in Spencer after college. He got a job at a prestigious firm in Atlanta, started earning good money, and moved into a new residential area. He bought expensive clothes, a brand new BMW, and began to speak differently, as if he had forgotten where he came from. When he came to visit on Sundays, he always arrived in a hurry, constantly checking his phone, always with some excuse to leave early. "I have an important meeting, Dad," he would say, without even sitting down to eat our Sunday dinner. Clients don't wait. But what hurt the most was how he introduced me to his friends. "He's my dad," he would say dryly, never mentioning that I had built half the houses where they lived. Once, at a family gathering, I overheard him telling his cousin Bethany that he had pulled himself out of poverty thanks to his own effort and talent. It was as if I didn't exist, as if those 5 years of university had paid for themselves. His architect friends were just like him, young men from affluent families who talked about sustainability and avant-garde design while sipping $20 cups of specialty coffee. When I showed up at their gatherings in my work clothes and with my calloused hands, I would see them exchange glances as if I were a source of shame Spencer had to bear. "My dad is a hard worker," Spencer would say with a forced smile. "Just a simple man from the neighborhood. You know how it is." The final straw came when he bought that 2-story house in Greystone Manor, a $560,000 house, with a yard, a 2-car garage, and a fountain at the entrance. On the day of the housewarming party, he invited all his architect friends, his bosses, and important clients. He invited me, as he put it, so I could see how successful people live. I showed up in my best shirt, the blue one I wear on Sundays, and my clean shoes. But even so, when his guests asked what I did for a living, Spencer answered for me. "My dad works in construction, very hands-on." He said the word hands-on as if it were a disease. That night, watching my son show off his new house, his BMW in the driveway, and his elegant friends drinking expensive wine, I realized I had raised a stranger who was ashamed of the very hands that had paid for his education, of the very back that had been bent for years, so he could stand there bragging about a life he didn't appreciate. What Spencer didn't know, what none of his friends suspected, was that I knew every brick of that house, every steel rebar, every bag of cement, because I had constructed that entire residential development in 1998, when it was nothing more than a vacant lot full of scrub brush. To anyone who saw us on Sundays at 12 Mass at St. John's Church, we were the perfect family in Oakwood Springs. Me, Charles Dixon, the respected mason who never broke a promise, and my son Spencer, the successful architect who had made it and returned every week to visit his widowed father. We would sit in the third pew on the right, me in my starched shirt and shined shoes, him in his brand-name suits that cost more than my monthly income. And people would look at us with admiration. "Doesn't Mr. Chuck look nice with his son, the architect?" The ladies would whisper after communion, an example of family achievement, but the reality was very different. After Mass, Spencer would take me to breakfast at the Old Mill Grill on Main Street, always requesting a table on the terrace where the whole town could see us. "I want them to see me with you, Dad," he'd say while checking his phone between bites. "It's important to maintain the image." I always ordered the same thing, catfish and grits with homemade biscuits. He would order a spinach salad with ahi tuna and imported mineral water. While we ate, he told me about his important projects, his wealthy clients, the buildings he was designing in Atlanta. But he never asked how I was, how my week had been, or if I needed anything. To him, I was like an old piece of furniture that had to be kept presentable but didn't have much to contribute to the conversation. "Dad, you have to understand," he would tell me while paying the check with his gold credit card. "I move in different circles now. My clients, my partners, they're educated, refined people. It's not that I'm ashamed of you, but we have to know what environment we fit into." After breakfast, he would drive me around town in his BMW with the windows down so everyone could see him. He would greet acquaintances from the driver's seat while I sat silently in the passenger seat. "There goes Spencer with Don Chuck," people would comment. "What a good son. Never abandons his father." But I felt the exact opposite. He paraded me around as if I were an old trophy, evidence of his humility and his roots. At the end of every visit, there was always the same ritual. He would drop me off at the entrance of my house, get out of the car, and give me a quick hug, more for the neighbors to see than for real affection. "Take care, Dad," he would say as he climbed back into his BMW. "I'll bring you something nice from the city next week." But nothing ever arrived. No call during the week, no message asking how I was, no surprise visit, only Sundays, only to maintain appearances, only so people would continue to think he was a good son. What hurt me the most was the difference between how he treated me in public and in private. In public, it was all smiles and my dad this and my dad that. But when we were alone, his comments were different. "Dad, you're too old to be carrying 94-pound bags of cement," he would say condescendingly. "You should think about retiring. I could help you with some money every month." Or when he saw my work clothes, "Dad, I'm going to buy you some better shirts. You can't always be walking around like a laborer." He pronounced the word laborer as if it were a curse. Throughout those years, I kept my double life perfectly hidden. In my 2-room home, I lived as the humble mason everyone knew. I ate off melamine plates, watched television on a 20-year-old set, slept in the same iron bed where I had slept with my wife. But in a safe hidden behind a family portrait, I kept deeds to 18 properties, bank certificates of deposit, and documents worth over $7 million. Every Sunday after Spencer drove away in his BMW, I would sit on my wooden porch, watching the dust settle on the street. I thought about all the buildings I had raised, all the families living in houses built by my hands, all the money I had quietly earned and saved. And I wondered if my son would ever realize that the old mason who embarrassed him was in reality far richer than he was. But that day arrived sooner than I thought, and in the most painful way possible. The first disrespect I clearly remember was at his cousin Bethy's wedding 3 years ago. I had arrived early at St. Joseph's Church, dressed in my only suit, the black one I bought for my wife's funeral. Spencer arrived 15 minutes late with a blonde woman he introduced as his architect colleague from the firm. When he saw me waiting for him at the entrance, he approached and whispered in my ear, "Dad, please don't mention you work in construction. Tell people you're, I don't know, retired or something." His words hit me like a bucket of cold water, but I nodded because I didn't want to ruin my niece's wedding. Throughout the entire ceremony and reception, every time someone asked me what I did, I replied, "I'm retired," while Spencer smiled in relief from his table. But the most humiliating moment was when the bride's father, my friend Earl Miller, proposed a toast and mentioned Don Chuck Dixon, who built the house where the newlyweds grew up. Spencer turned pale with embarrassment and later lashed out at me. "Why didn't you tell me you worked on the Miller family's house? You made me look bad in front of my colleague." From that day on, the insults became more frequent. When he invited me to his work events, he would introduce me simply as my dad, without mentioning my name or my occupation. If anyone insisted on asking, he would vaguely reply, "He works for himself, does odd jobs here and there." Once, at a dinner with his bosses, one of them asked me directly what kind of business I owned. Spencer jumped in and said, "My dad is very modest. He doesn't like to talk about work." I kept quiet, but my stomach was churning inside. The limit was reached when they inaugurated a major commercial center that I had built 5 years earlier. Spencer invited me because he knew I would be happy to see the ribbon cutting. We arrived in his BMW, him in a designer suit and me in my good Sunday shirt. As we toured the facility with a group of architects and developers, one of them commented, "This structure is incredibly well made." The general contractor really knew what they were doing. I was about to say, "I built it," when Spencer grabbed my arm and said, "Yes, it's impressive what good engineers can achieve." He squeezed my arm hard, as if telling me to keep quiet. That night, when he drove me back home, I asked him why I couldn't talk about my work. "Dad," he said in a tired tone, "you just don't understand how my professional world works. If I say my dad is a bricklayer, people will look at me differently. They'll think I came from nothing, that I have no class." I told him there was nothing wrong with starting from nothing. That honest work was no cause for shame, but he just shook his head. "You don't get it, Dad. You don't know how hard it is to maintain a certain social position. Business is done between equals, and I need them to see me as an equal." From that moment on, Spencer started visiting me less, from every Sunday to every other week. Then, once a month, his calls became more spaced out and shorter. When I did see him, he always seemed rushed, always anxious to leave. "I have too many projects, Dad," he would explain while checking his expensive watch. "When I'm freer, I'll come spend more time with you." But that time never arrived. The few Sundays he did come, he spent on his phone closing deals or discussing blueprints with some client. I became a spectator of his life, someone who had to be tolerated out of family obligation but who contributed nothing valuable. The breaking point arrived 6 months ago when he bought the house in Greystone Manor. During the housewarming party, he kept me practically hidden in the kitchen, serving snacks and washing dishes as if I were part of the service staff. When his friends asked who I was, he replied, "That's my dad. He's helping me with logistics." Helping with logistics, as if I were a temporary employee. I left early that night, heartbroken, but with a clear decision made in my mind. I had tolerated enough humiliation. It was time for my son to learn who his father truly was, and more importantly, who he was not. What my son never knew, what no one in Oakwood Springs knew, was that I had begun building my silent empire in the 1,960 seconds when he was still a child playing with toy cars in the yard of our house. It all started with a lesson my employer, Mr. Earl Miller, taught me when I was barely 20 years old and working as an assistant in his construction company. "Look, Chuck," he told me one afternoon as we surveyed a vacant lot on the outskirts of town. "Construction puts food on the table, but real estate makes you rich. Every dollar you earn, save half. Every cheap piece of land you see, buy it. In 20 years, you'll thank me for this advice." And so I did. For 40 years, every dollar I earned was split into 3 parts. One for household expenses, one for Spencer's education, and the third to buy land nobody wanted, lots on the edge of town where only weeds grew. Stony plots that owners sold cheap because they thought they would never be good for anything. I bought them with wrinkled bills I kept in a coffee can hidden under my bed. My first investment was in 1965. A half-acre plot for $2,000 that an old rancher wanted to sell to buy medicine. That land is now the Oakwood Mall and is worth over $1 million. But I continued to live the same way, with the same humility, wearing the same work clothes, eating the same rice and beans. In 1972, I bought 3 more lots where the Gardens District now stands. In 1978, I acquired the entire parcel of land where the Greystone Manor residential development, the very one where Spencer lives, would later be built. By the 1,980 seconds, when my son was in high school dreaming of becoming an architect, I already owned 18 properties in different parts of town. But no one knew because I personally built the houses I later sold or rented. I worked during the day as an employee for other construction companies, and at night and on weekends, I raised my own projects. My wife, rest her soul, thought the extra jobs were to pay for Spencer's studies. And in part, that was true. But most of the money went into buying more land, more materials, more projects. I developed a perfect system to keep my secret. All the deeds were in the names of different nominees. My friend Marcus, my cousin Lyle, my brother-in-law Dean. They signed the papers, and I managed the business. In return, I gave them a small percentage of the profits, and the promise that if anything happened to me, they would keep 1 property each. I always signed the construction contracts as Charles Dixon, independent contractor, never as the owner. When I sold the houses, the money was deposited into 5 different bank accounts, all in banks in neighboring towns where no one knew me. To the outside world, I was still the humble mason living in a modest house, always with dirty hands. But in reality, every brick I laid, every bag of cement I carried, every steel rod I bent, was an investment in my future and my family's future. The problem was that my family never knew. Spencer grew up seeing his dad leave before dawn with a lunch pail and return at dusk, tired and covered in dust. He never saw the late-night meetings with architects and engineers in the back room of Mr. And Poncho's hardware store. He never knew about the hours I spent reviewing blueprints and calculating budgets by the light of a candle to save on electricity. He never found out that half the houses where his schoolmates lived had been built by his father. To him, I was always Dad the bricklayer, the man who broke his back so he could study and get ahead. And perhaps that was what I wanted him to think. Perhaps I wanted him to value the effort before he knew the results. But when I saw that his professional success was turning him into a person who was ashamed of his roots, when I heard him treat me like a nuisance instead of the man who had made his career possible, I decided it was time to show my hand. The humiliation on that rainy afternoon when he yelled in front of his friends that I couldn't even afford a bus fare was the drop that overflowed the glass of 40 years of patience and silent work. Living with a $7 million secret for 40 years requires a discipline I didn't even know I possessed. Every morning I woke up at 5, put on my patched work clothes, ate black coffee and cheap donuts, and went out into the street as the same humble mason everyone knew. But at night, after the town went to sleep, I became an entirely different person. In my back room, hidden behind the old wardrobe where I kept my Sunday clothes, I had set up a small office no one suspected. A wooden table with blueprints spread out, a calculator, a separate phone, and a desk lamp that cast the most discreet light possible. There, I reviewed reports from my administrators, planned new investments, and calculated the profits from my 18 properties. It was like living 2 parallel lives in the same body. During the day, I carried 94-pound cement bags on my back, sweated under the sun building houses for other bosses, ate bean tacos wrapped in newspaper, and drank shared water with 5 other laborers. But at night, I reviewed bank statements, showing balances of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I signed rental contracts for houses that generated more money in a month than I earned officially in a year. And I planned land purchases that would cost more than a lifetime of labor. The hardest part of maintaining this double life was controlling every detail that could give me away. I could never buy anything noticeable, no new clothes, no expensive shoes, not even a bigger television. My house remained exactly the same as when my wife passed away. Same old furniture, same old gas range, same bathroom door that didn't close properly. The only concession I allowed myself was to buy beef once a week, but I bought it in butcher shops in neighboring towns, so no one in Oakwood Springs would see me spending too much money. My nominees were essential to keeping the secret. Marcus managed 3 properties downtown. Lyle administered 5 houses in the Gardens district, and Dean was in charge of 4 apartments I had built near the high school. Each one received his percentage and maintained absolute silence. If anyone asks, I told them, you are the owner. I'm just the one who built them. But there were dangerous moments where I was almost discovered. Once, 5 years ago, the mayor offered me a multi-million-dollar contract to build the town's new public market. I knew I could do it perfectly. I had the experience, the contacts, and even the capital to front the materials. But accepting that project would have been impossible for a simple mason to explain. I had to refuse and watch as they gave it to a construction company from Atlanta that charged double and took 6 months longer to finish. Another time, Spencer asked me for $10,000 for the down payment on his BMW. It was an amount I had in cash under the mattress, but giving him that money would have immediately raised suspicions. I had to tell him I hadn't saved anything, that I barely had enough for basic expenses. I watched him leave disappointed, thinking his father was a financial failure, when in reality, I had more money in the bank than he would earn in his entire career. The psychological price of this double life was enormous. Every day, I had to act like a man without resources, accept being viewed with pity, and endure comments about my poor economic situation without being able to defend myself. The ladies of the town would give me food on Sundays, thinking I couldn't afford to eat properly. Merchants would give me discounts for being a long-time customer and a hard-working man. The doctor treated me for free because he thought I didn't have health insurance. And I accepted everything with feigned humility, knowing that a single check from my bank account could solve all their financial problems put together. But the most painful thing was seeing how my own son had adopted this false image of me. To Spencer, I was truly the poor old man who needed his help and his compassion. When he gave me a $20 bill to buy myself something nice, I accepted it with feigned gratitude while carrying $50 in cash in my wallet. When he offered to pay me for a small job at his office to have extra income, I nodded as if I really needed that charity, knowing that my monthly rental income was 10 times his architect's salary. This charade had worked for decades, but on that rainy afternoon when he yelled that I couldn't even afford a bus fare, something broke inside me. 40 years of maintaining a lie to protect my family's humility, and my son had turned it into a reason to despise me. On that rainy Tuesday in October, I had finished my work early on the construction of Dr. Holloway's new medical office. It was 5:00 the afternoon when I decided to stop by Spencer's house to ask him for $5 for the bus ride home. It wasn't that I truly needed the money. I had over $200 in my wallet, but I wanted to use that excuse to visit him, to try to reach out to my son, who felt increasingly distant. I arrived walking in the rain, soaked, and with my boots full of mud, carrying my lunch pail and my scratched yellow hard hat. When I knocked on the door of his 2-story house, I heard laughter and voices from inside. Spencer opened the door, dressed in a cashmere sweater and pressed dress pants. Behind him, I could see 4 of his architect colleagues sitting in the living room, drinking whiskey and reviewing blueprints on the glass coffee table. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked with an uncomfortable look of surprise, as if I had arrived at the most inopportune moment possible. "Sorry to show up like this, son," I said, taking off my dripping hat. "But I finished late and didn't have time to stop by the house to change. Could you lend me $5 for the bus? I'll pay you back on Sunday like always." Spencer turned toward his friends, who had interrupted their conversation to observe the scene. One of them, a blond young man with designer glasses, stood up from the sofa with his glass of whiskey in hand. "Aren't you going to introduce us to your visitor, Spencer?" he asked with a mocking smile. My son became visibly nervous. Yeah, of course. He's my dad." The words came out as if he were apologizing. The blond architect examined me from head to toe, seeing my muddy boots, my soaked clothes, my hard hat tucked under my arm. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Dixon," he said, extending his hand but not truly approaching. "You work in construction, I presume?" "Yes, young man," I replied, trying to smile. "Been doing it for over 40 years. "How interesting," the blonde said, returning to his seat. "I suppose it's been difficult raising a family with that type of work." Spencer turned red now with shame. I could see in his eyes that he wanted me to disappear as quickly as possible. "Dad, do you seriously need the $5 right now? We're in the middle of a major meeting." "Oh, let him in, Spencer," shouted another friend from the living room. He already interrupted. "Let him tell us what life in the neighborhood is like." Spencer looked at me with a mixture of desperation and anger. "No, Dad. Maybe another time." But I had already taken a step inside, thinking that perhaps this was a chance to meet my son's friends, to be a part of his world for a few minutes. "Grave mistake. Dad, it's really not a good time," Spencer insisted. But one of the architects, a dark-haired man with a perfectly groomed beard, stood up out of curiosity. "You know what, Mr. Dixon? I'm genuinely curious. How much does someone like you earn a day? We're calculating labor costs for a project." My son tensed up completely. "I don't think that's appropriate." No, it's all right," I interrupted. "I earn between $150 to $200 daily, depending on the job." The 4 architects exchanged glances that I didn't interpret at the time, but which I now understand perfectly. It was pity mixed with superiority. $200, the blonde repeated. "That's what we spend on one lunch." They all laughed, except for Spencer, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "Well, Dad," he said, taking me by the arm, "I'll give you the $5, but you have to leave now. We have important work to discuss." He pulled out his wallet and handed me a $20 bill. "Keep the change," he said, as if he were giving me a tip. "But next time, give me a heads up before you come over. I can't always drop everything for you." It was at that moment that the architect with the beard said the phrase that changed everything. "Hey, Spencer, your dad doesn't have a cell phone in the 21st century. How is it possible that someone can't even afford to communicate?" And that's when my son, my own son, the person I had worked 40 years in silence for, looked at me with contempt and yelled in front of all his friends, "You couldn't even afford a bus fare. How are you going to have a phone when you can't even pay for a ride home?" The silence that followed was deafening. The four architects fell quiet, probably shocked by the cruelty of the words. I stood there with the $20 bill in my hand, and my heart shattering into pieces. "Spencer," I whispered. "It's the truth, Dad," he continued, without lowering his voice. "Look at you at your age, drenched and asking for a loan. What are my colleagues going to think?" I smiled. For the first time in 40 years of feigned humility, I smiled genuinely. "You're right, son," I said, putting the bill away. "I couldn't even afford a bus fare." I put on my wet hat, politely said goodbye to his friends, and walked out into the rain. But as I walked toward my house, I was no longer the same man who had knocked on that door 30 minutes earlier. That night, for the first time in decades, I was going to show the world who Charles Dixon really was. I arrived at my house, soaked to the bone, but with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in years. I took off my wet clothes, put on my old flannel pajamas, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and my thoughts. The rain continued to beat against the metal roof, but I heard nothing but my son's words echoing in my head. "You couldn't even afford a bus fare." It was 8 that night when I made the decision that would change everything. I got up from the table, moved the heavy wardrobe in my room, and pulled out the safe I had kept hidden for decades. Inside were all my secrets, deeds, bank statements, contracts, documents, proving that the useless old man who had just been humiliated owned half the town. But what interested me most that night was a specific folder, the investigation I had commissioned into Spencer's finances 6 months earlier. Yes, because even though my son thought I was ignorant, I knew his real financial situation perfectly well. I had hired a private investigator from Atlanta to find out everything about my son's debts. The results were there on white sheets with red numbers that told a very different story from the one Spencer bragged about. His 2-story house in Greystone Manor, 100% mortgaged with the First Southern Bank. Value $560,000. Debt $500,000. Past due payments. 3 monthly installments of $2,200 each. His brand new BMW, financed for 5 years with monthly payments of $1,200. Current debt $30,000. Past due payments 2 installments. Credit cards 4 cards, maxed out at their limits. Total debt $25,000. Late fees accumulating daily. My successful son, the architect who boasted of his perfect life, was broke, more than broke. He was on the verge of losing everything he had. And the worst part was that he had never asked me for help. He preferred to humiliate me rather than admit he needed his useless father. That information hurt me more than his insults because I realized that he not only despised me, but preferred to sink before recognizing that he needed me. I picked up my landline phone and dialed Attorney Holloway's number. It was 9:30 at night, but he had been my friend for 50 years, and he knew I would only call him at that hour if it was important. "Chuck, what happened? Are you all right?" he asked with a worried voice. "Counselor, I need you to do me an urgent favor," I said without preamble. "I want to buy a house tonight, my son Spencer's house. I know he owes 3 payments to the bank. I want to buy it outright before they take it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Chuck, are you sure about what you're asking me to do? It's your son, and it's also a huge amount of money." "Counselor, I've spent 40 years gathering this money for something important, and I believe teaching my son a lesson is the most important thing I can do with it. How much do you have available?" "I have $3 million, $200,000 in cash at my house, plus what I have in the bank, if necessary. Another silence. Attorney Holloway knew about my properties, but I had never told him the exact amount of my fortune. All right, Chuck, but I need you to explain what happened with your son that makes you want to do this. I told him everything. The humiliation that afternoon, the years of disrespect, how Spencer was ashamed of me while I had paid for his entire career, how he preferred to go bankrupt rather than ask me for help. When I finished, Jim sighed deeply. I understand your pain, old friend, but are you sure this is the right way to handle the situation? Counselor, there are times in a father's life when he has to show his son who he really is. My son thinks I'm a failure, that I'm worthless, that I couldn't even afford a bus fare. It's time for him to learn that judging by appearances can be the most expensive mistake of his life. All right, give me an hour to make the necessary calls. The bank will be willing to negotiate if we offer to pay the entire debt plus a commission. Are you coming over with the cash? I'm leaving right now. I hung up the phone, packed the money into my old leather briefcase, and got dressed in my best clothes. That night, Charles Dixon was going to stop pretending to be poor. That night, my son was going to discover who his father truly was. Attorney Holloway's office had never seen so much activity at 11 at night. When I arrived with my leather briefcase, the director of the First Southern Bank, the public notary, and the specialized collections manager were already there. They had all been summoned with a single phrase from Jim. I have a client who wants to liquidate a full mortgage debt in cash tonight. In the world of banking, those words open doors that are normally closed. The director, a bald man in his 50s named Mr. Robert Hayes, looked at me curiously when I placed the briefcase on the desk. Are you Mr. Dixon? He asked, reviewing a thick folder. I see here that the debtor is your son, Spencer Dixon. Is he aware of this transaction? My son will find out tomorrow, I replied, opening the briefcase. For now, all I care about is whether you can transfer the complete property to me tonight. The director's eyes widened when he saw the money perfectly organized in stacks of new bills. $560,000, exactly, to cover the debt, plus $20,000 extra as an urgent service commission. Mr. Dixon, the collections manager, said to me, in 30 years of working at this bank, I've never seen anyone pay a full mortgage in cash, much less in a single night. Is what we're doing legal? I asked the notary, an older gentleman I knew by sight but had never spoken to. It is completely legal, he replied, reviewing the documents. The property has a lien due to the mortgage. If you liquidate that debt, the bank can transfer the property to you immediately. Your son will be debt-free, but you become the new owner. Perfect. How much time do you need? Attorney Holloway spoke up. We need 2 hours to prepare all the documents. The bank has to verify that the bills are authentic. The notary must draft the new deeds, and I have to prepare the transfer documents. While they worked, I sat in the office thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 40 years of work, 40 years of saving, 40 years building a silent empire, all to arrive at this night, where I would finally prove to my son who his father really was. At 1:00 the morning, the bank director confirmed that all the bills were authentic and that the transaction could proceed. Mr. Dixon, officially your son no longer owes the bank anything. The mortgage has been fully liquidated, but now you are the property's creditor. What exactly does that mean? It means you can decide what to do with the house. You can give it to your son, you can sell it to him, you can rent it to him, or you can ask him to leave. Legally, it is your house. At 2:00 the morning, all the documents were ready. The notary explained every paper I signed, every clause, every right I was acquiring. These are the original deeds to the house, he said, showing me a green folder. Here is the final settlement of the bank debt, and this is the document that certifies you as the new legal owner of the property located at 42 Greystone Lane. When I left the office at 2:30 the morning, I was no longer the same man who had walked in 4 hours earlier. In my briefcase, I carried the most important documents of my life, the papers that proved that the useless old man, who couldn't even afford a bus fare, had just bought his architect's son's house. But before confronting Spencer, I had one more call to make. I dialed the number of my friend Marcus, who managed 3 of my properties. "Chuck, what's going on? Why are you calling so late?" "Marcus, I need you to do something for me first thing tomorrow morning. I want you to take an envelope with the documents I'll give you to my son Spencer. But don't tell him they're from me. Tell him you're a process server and that he has an important citation." "A citation for what?" "So he finds out that his house is no longer his." Silence on the other end of the phone lasted almost a full minute. "Chuck, are you serious?" "What I had to do, friend. What I should have done many years ago. I couldn't sleep that morning. I stayed seated on my wooden porch, watching the sun rise over Oakwood Springs, with the folder of documents on my lap and a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. At 6:00 the morning, my phone rang. It was Attorney Holloway confirming that all the paperwork was complete and that the public registry had been notified of the change of ownership. "Chuck, you officially own your son's house," he told me. "The documents are in order and the bank has released the lien. Are you sure you want to proceed with the notification?" "More sure than ever, counselor." "Have Marcus go at 9 exactly." At 8:30, my friend Marcus arrived at my house, dressed in his best suit and carrying a manila folder I had prepared. "Chuck, brother, I never thought you'd go this far," he said, looking over the documents. "Your son is going to have the surprise of his life." "He's going to have the lesson of his life," I corrected him. "And you just limit yourself to handing him the papers. Tell him it's an urgent legal notification and that he has to sign for receipt. That's all." Marcus walked toward Greystone Manor while I prepared for the most important moment of my life. I showered, put on my best white shirt, my dress pants, and my shined shoes. For the first time in 40 years, I wasn't dressing like the humble mason. Today, I was dressing like what I truly was, a businessman who had just made the most expensive acquisition of his life. At 9:15, my phone rang. It was Marcus. "It's done, friend." I handed him the documents, and he signed for receipt. He seemed confused, but he signed without asking questions. He asked me what it was about, and I just told him to read the papers carefully. How did he look? Nervous. He was in his pajamas and looked like he hadn't slept well. He told me he'd had a difficult night thinking about something that happened yesterday. I suppose he was referring to what he did to you. I hung up the phone and waited. I knew that at any moment Spencer would open that folder, read the documents, and realize what had happened. The papers were clear. Notification of change of ownership. Mr. Spencer Dixon is hereby informed that the property located at 42 Greystone Lane has been acquired by Mr. Charles Dixon through the total liquidation of the mortgage debt. The new owner requests an urgent meeting to discuss terms of occupancy. At 9:30, my phone exploded. "Dad, what does this mean?" Spencer screamed from the other end of the line. His voice sounded desperate, confused, on the verge of panic. "Good morning, son," I replied calmly. "Did you read the documents?" "Dad, it says here that you bought my house. That's impossible. You don't have money. It must be a bank error." "It's no mistake, Spencer. Last night, I paid your full debt to the First Southern Bank, $560,000 in cash. Your house is mine now." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted almost a minute. I could hear his agitated breathing, his confusion, his total disbelief. But where did you get that much money? You work as a bricklayer. You asked me to borrow $5. You don't even have a cell phone. That's a conversation we need to have in person, son. I'll be waiting for you at your house, at my house, at 10 this morning. We have a lot to talk about. It can't be true. I'm going to call the bank. This has to be a scam. Call the bank. Call the notary. Call whoever you want. The documents are in order, and the money has been paid. I'll see you there at 10. I hung up the phone, and, for the first time in decades, I felt completely free. Free from pretending to be poor. Free from accepting humiliation. Free from living a lie to protect the pride of others. I grabbed my keys, left my humble house, and walked toward Greystone Manor. I was going to visit my new property, the house I had bought with 40 years of silent work, the same house where 24 hours earlier my son had yelled that I couldn't even afford a bus fare. The moment of truth had arrived. I arrived at the house on Greystone Manor exactly at 10:00 0 inches the morning. My house. It was strange to think of it that way, after so many years seeing it as my son's property. The symbol of his success, the proof that he had managed to surpass his father. Now it was mine, bought with the money he believed I didn't have. I knocked on the door with firm, confident taps. It wasn't the timid way I had knocked the day before, asking for $5. Today, I knocked as the owner. Spencer opened the door, still in his pajamas, his hair disheveled and the look of someone who hadn't slept. His eyes were red and his cheeks were sunken. In his right hand, he held the documents Marcus had delivered, all wrinkled as if he had read them hundreds of times, searching for some error, some logical explanation. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking, "please tell me this is a joke. Tell me it's a lie." "Good morning, son. Will you invite me into my house?" I asked, without changing my calm tone. "Dad, stop saying that. This is not your house. You couldn't have bought it. You don't have the money." He stepped aside to let me pass, but not out of courtesy. He seemed to need to lean on the wall. The living room was exactly the same as the day before, with the same elegant furniture, the same glass table, the same empty whiskey glasses from his meeting with the architects. But now all of it was mine. "Did you call the bank?" I asked, sitting on his Italian leather sofa. Yes, I called," he mumbled, slumping into the armchair. "I spoke with the director. He confirmed that someone paid my debt in full last night, $560,000 in cash. But he wouldn't tell me who it was until I came in person with ID. It was me, son." "How?" he shouted, jumping to his feet. "Where did you get that kind of money? You earn $200 a day. You don't even have a cell phone. You asked me to borrow $5. I pulled a folder from under my shirt that I had brought especially for this moment. Inside were the deeds to my 18 properties, the bank statements from my 5 different banks, and the rental contracts that generated over $6,000 a month. "Spencer, sit down. It's time you met your father." I placed the documents on the glass table one by one, like cards in a poker game where you finally reveal your winning hand. "This is the deed to the apartment building downtown. I built it in 1980. It's worth $2 million. "What?" he whispered, staring at the document. "This is the deed to the shopping center where you worked as a teenager. I built it in 1987. It's worth $5 million. His eyes widened with each paper. "These are the deeds to the 6 houses I rent in the Gardens district. I built them between 1990 and 1995. They're worth $150,000 each." No, it can't be true." "And these," I said, pulling out the bank statements, "are my current savings. 3 different banks. $7 million in total assets." Spencer took one of the bank statements with trembling hands. He read it line by line, verified the dates, and checked the official seals. "Why?" he asked, his voice broken. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I wanted you to value the work before you knew the results. I wanted you to respect the effort before you saw the reward. I wanted to raise a humble son, not an arrogant one. But I treated you badly. I humiliated you yesterday. I yelled at you in front of my friends. Yes, son, you yelled that I couldn't even afford a bus fare. And now the man who supposedly couldn't even afford a bus fare has just bought the house of the successful architect who was broke and never had the courage to ask his father for help." Spencer collapsed completely, covering his face with his hands and beginning to cry the way I hadn't seen him cry since he was a child. "Dad, forgive me. I didn't know. I had no idea." "Spencer, look at me," I said firmly. "My whole life, I worked in silence so you could study, so you could have opportunities, so you could go far. But somewhere along the way, you confused having an education with being a better person. You confused having a degree with having class. You confused earning money with having greater worth. You're right. You're completely right. Yesterday you told me I couldn't even afford a bus fare. Today I own your house, your life, and the most expensive lesson you will ever receive in your entire existence." Spencer continued to cry for several minutes. The documents scattered on the table were irrefutable evidence of an entire life he had misinterpreted. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were swollen, and his face reflected a mixture of shame, disbelief, and something I hadn't seen in years: genuine respect for his father. "Dad," he said, his voice choked. "I need to make a call. I need to tell someone else." He picked up his phone and dialed a number I knew very well, my sister Vivian, his favorite aunt who lived in Atlanta. Vivian had always been Spencer's confidant, the person he told his problems to when he didn't want to worry me. "Aunt Viv, it's Spencer," he said, trying to control his voice. "I need to tell you something incredible that just happened with Dad." He put the phone on speaker so I could hear the conversation. "What's wrong, baby? Is Chuck okay?" Vivian asked with immediate concern. "Auntie, my dad just bought my house. He paid off my entire mortgage. $560,000. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "How did your dad buy your house, Spencer? Are you all right? Have you been drinking?" "No, Auntie. It's real. My dad is a millionaire. He has properties all over town. He has millions in the bank, and I never knew." "Spencer, my boy, what are you talking about? Your dad is a mason. He lives in that little house. He eats beans every day." "That's what we all thought," Spencer shouted. But it was a lie. It was all a lie. He's been pretending to be poor for 40 years. Vivian was completely speechless. After a long minute, she spoke with a trembling voice. "Put your father on the phone." Spencer handed me the phone. "Hello, sister," I said naturally. "Charles Dixon," she replied in a tone. I had never heard a mixture of astonishment and reproach. "Are you going to explain what's going on? Is what Spencer is saying true?" "It's true, Vivian. I bought my son's house last night because he was about to lose it for lack of payment." "But where did you get the money? How is it possible that you have so much cash?" "Sister, I've been building houses and buying properties for 40 years. I never told you because I wanted to keep my life private. Chuck, I've been sending you food on Sundays, thinking you didn't have enough to eat. I've been giving you my husband's used clothes. You've made me feel like a fool for years." Her voice broke at the end. Spencer looked at me with a horrified expression, as if each revelation was worse than the last. "Aunt Vivian also helped you financially?" he asked. "Your aunt? Your cousins? The neighbors half the town?" I replied. "Everyone believed I was a poor old man who needed charity, and I allowed it because I thought it was better for them to see me as humble than to know the truth." Vivian continued on the phone. "Chuck, this is too much. Who else knows the truth? Only my friend Marcus, my cousin Lyle, my brother-in-law Dean, and attorney Holloway. They helped me manage the properties." "I can't believe it. I'm coming down there immediately. I need to see this with my own eyes." She hung up without saying goodbye. Spencer stared at me as if it were the first time he was truly seeing me in his life. "Dad, how many people have been helping you, believing you were poor?" "Spencer, false humility generates more charity than real humility. For 40 years, I accepted food, clothes, medicine, discounts, and favors, all because people believed I needed it. And maybe deep down, I did need it, not the money, but knowing that there were people who cared about me. But didn't you feel bad deceiving all those people? I felt worse seeing my own son being ashamed of me. All those people treated me with respect and kindness." Just then, his phone rang. It was his ex-colleague, Sarah, the architect he had brought to Bethy's wedding. "Spencer, I just heard from your cousin that your dad bought your house. Is it true?" "She found out," Sarah said. "Your cousin Bethany just called Sarah, and Sarah told Miguel, and Miguel is telling everyone at the office. Dad, by this afternoon, the whole town is going to know you're a millionaire." "Good," I said, getting up from the sofa. It was time for the truth to come out. By 2 that afternoon, my phone hadn't stopped ringing. First it was Mr. Dodd, Earl Miller, the bride's father at the wedding where Spencer had asked me to lie about my job. "Chuck, is it true that you built my house 20 years ago and that you own other properties?" Then came Mrs. Eleanor, who gave me meals after Sunday Mass. "Mr. Dixon, my granddaughter tells me you are very rich. Why did you never tell me when I brought you food?" But the call that shocked me the most was from the mayor. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Dixon, I need to speak with you urgently. There are things I don't understand about the real estate development in our town." I told him I would be at his office in an hour. Spencer insisted on accompanying me. "Dad, I need to be there when you talk to him. I need to fully understand what you've been doing all these years." We arrived at City Hall, and the mayor received us with a thick folder on his desk. "Mr. Dixon, I've been reviewing the construction records for the last 40 years. Your name appears as the contractor on 18 different projects, but never as the owner. However, my assistants have been investigating, and it turns out you are the true owner of most of these developments." I nodded. "Can you explain why you kept this a secret for so long?" "Mayor, when I started building and buying properties in the 1960s, this town was very different. Envy and jealousy destroyed businesses. I decided to work in silence to avoid problems. But Mr. Dixon, do you realize that you practically developed half of Oakwood Springs, the shopping center, the Gardens District, Greystone Manor, the apartment building downtown, the houses in the New Hope subdivision? All of that is yours." Spencer stared at me with his mouth open. "All of that is yours, Dad." "Yes, son. And I also own the land where they're going to build the new high school and the regional hospital." The mayor leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Dixon, according to our calculations, you have generated more jobs and economic development in this town than anyone else in the last 50 years. Why did you live the way you lived?" "Because I wanted my employees, my tenants, and my neighbors to see me as an equal, not as a rich boss exploiting them." "But didn't you realize the impact this had on your family?" "That is my biggest mistake, Mayor. I thought it was better for my son to respect me for my work than for my money, but I ended up raising a son who respected me for neither." Spencer stood up from his chair. "Dad, with the mayor's permission, I need to say something." "Go ahead, young man. My father is right. I grew up watching a man who woke up before dawn, who worked under the sun, who came home tired and covered in dust. And instead of admiring that dedication, I was ashamed of it. I thought that being successful meant moving away from all that, when in reality, all my success was owed to exactly that." The mayor nodded. "Mr. Dixon, there is one more thing I need to discuss with you. The regional hospital project needs a principal investor. We had considered seeking capital from Atlanta, but if you are interested, Mayor, I will build that entire hospital myself, without partners, without bank loans. It will be my gift to the town that has given me everything." "Are you serious? That project costs $2,500,000. Mayor, I have $3 million in the bank, and 18 properties worth another $4 million. $2. $5 million for a hospital is not a problem." Spencer froze. $7 million? "Dad, you have $7 million? "Yes, son. And it all started with the first $2,000 I earned building a fence for Mr. Miller when I was your age." The mayor stood up and extended his hand to me. "Mr. Dixon, I officially invite you to be part of the Economic Development Council for our municipality. Oakwood Springs needs men with your vision and experience." "I accept with one condition," I told him. "I want my son Spencer to be the principal architect for all future projects. He is a good professional, and he needs to learn that business is done with humility, not arrogance." Spencer looked at me with tears in his eyes. "You would do that for me after how I treated you?" "Everything I did in my life was for you, son. I'm not going to stop now." We left City Hall in silence. Spencer walked beside me, but for the first time in years, he seemed to truly see me, not as the old mason he was ashamed of, but as the man who had built an empire from nothing. When we arrived at my house, the same house where he had grown up, he stopped at the entrance as if it were the first time he was visiting. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking, "can I come in?" "It's your house, son." It has always been your house. But we both knew that something had changed forever. He was no longer the successful son visiting the poor father. Now he was the son who had lost everything, visiting the father who had everything. We sat in the kitchen, at the same wooden table where I had decided to buy his house the night before. Spencer looked around as if he were seeing everything for the first time. The adobe walls I had raised with my hands, the griddle where his mother used to make him tortillas, the family portrait that hid my safe. "Dad, I need to ask you something," he said after several minutes of silence. "Did you ever think about telling me the truth? Did you ever get tired of pretending?" "Every day, son. Every day I saw you being ashamed of me, and I wanted to scream who I really was. But then I told myself, if I tell him now, He'll think respect can be bought with money. He'll think he's worth more for being rich than for being a good person. And what changed yesterday? Yesterday I realized you were no longer a good person, Spencer. The money I wanted to prevent from changing you had already changed you anyway. You became arrogant, dismissive, cruel, and the worst part is, you became that way with money you didn't even have. His tears fell onto the wooden table like raindrops. You're right. I became everything I despise. I became those arrogant architects I met in college, those bosses who humiliate their employees, those people who think having an education makes them better than others. The problem wasn't your education, son. The problem was that you forgot where that education came from. You forgot that every book you bought, every project you submitted, every semester you attended was paid for with these calloused hands you despised yesterday. Spencer took my hands in his and examined them as if it were the first time he was truly seeing them. The scars from 40 years of construction, the permanent calluses on the palms, the broken nails from carrying bricks and mixing cement. These hands gave me everything I have, he whispered, and I treated them like they were a disgrace. Spencer, look at me closely, I said, taking him by the shoulders. I'm not punishing you. I didn't buy your house to humiliate you. I bought it to save you. You were broke. You were going to lose everything, and you preferred to sink rather than ask me for help. Why would you have helped me after how I treated you, after how I humiliated you? Because you are my son, because everything I built, everything I saved, everything I worked for was for you. It was always for you. He stood up from the table and walked toward the window that overlooked the backyard where there was a small tool shed I used for minor repairs. You know what hurts me the most, Dad? It's not losing the house. It's not finding out I was broke. What hurts the most is realizing that I never truly knew you. I lived 32 years with the most successful man in Oakwood Springs and never realized it. You knew me, son. You just knew the version I wanted you to know. The humble version. The version that worked for love, not for money. The version that woke up before dawn because I wanted to give you a better future, not because I was being paid to do it. The version that carried bags of cement with a broken back because I was building your education brick by brick. Spencer returned to the table and looked me directly in the eyes. Dad, I want you to know that from now on, things are going to be different. I want to learn from you. I want you to teach me how you built all of this. I want to work with you, not for you, but with you. Are you sure you won't be able to brag anymore that your dad is a poor, useless old man? I don't want to brag about anything anymore, Dad. I just want you to be proud of me for the right reasons. I stood up from the table and went to the wardrobe where I kept my secrets. I pulled out a folder I had never shown anyone, the original blueprints for a new subdivision I had been planning for 5 years. If you really want to work with me, I said, handing him the blueprints, this will be our first project together. A complete subdivision of 100 homes for working families, decent, beautiful, affordable houses. You'll be the architect, and I'll be the developer and builder. Spencer spread the blueprints on the table and studied them, his eyes shining with excitement. Dad, this design is incredible. How long have you been planning this? 5 years, son. 5 years waiting for the right moment to build something truly important. And that moment is now. That moment is now that I finally have a partner I can trust. 6 months after that night that changed everything, I am sitting on the same wooden porch of my house, but nothing is the same anymore. Spencer arrives every morning at 6, sharp, not in his BMW, which he had to sell to pay off other debts, but in a work pickup truck we bought together to transport materials. He now works with his hands just as I always did, and for the first time in his life, he understands and is proud to get them dirty. The New Hope subdivision, our project of 100 homes for working families, is almost finished. Spencer designed every house, thinking about the dignity of the people who will live there, not about impressing other architects. And I have built them with the same love with which I built everything else, but now with my son by my side, learning that true architecture is not taught in a university, but in the heart. The entire town changed the way they saw me after the truth came out. I no longer receive charity food on Sundays, but I still go to Mass in the same third pew on the right. The difference is that now, Spencer sits there, not out of family obligation, but because he genuinely wants to be with me. He no longer checks his phone during the sermon. He is no longer ashamed when Reverend Miguel mentions me in his prayers of gratitude for the new hospital we are building. My sister Vivian came from Atlanta 3 months ago to apologize personally. "Chuck," she told me with tears in her eyes, "I feel like such a fool for treating you like my poor brother all these years." But I explained the same thing to her that I explained to everyone. I never deceived them out of malice, but out of humility. I preferred for them to see me as someone who needed help than for them to see me as someone who could buy and sell the whole town. Attorney Holloway told me something a week ago that stuck with me. "Chuck, in 50 years of being an attorney, I have never seen someone use their wealth to teach a lesson in humility instead of using it to humiliate others." And he is right. I could have yelled at Spencer on that rainy night, "I'm richer than you, you ungrateful brat." I could have bragged about my fortune in front of his architect friends. It could have been my moment of revenge and exhibition. But I chose another way. I chose to demonstrate with actions, not with shouts, that judging by appearances can be the most expensive mistake of your life. The house I bought is still technically mine, but Spencer lives there with a symbolic rent contract of $1 a month, $1 that he pays me religiously every 30 days. Not for the money, but as a reminder that respect and trust are earned every day. They are not inherited. 2 weeks ago, we finished building the first house in the New Hope subdivision. When we handed the keys to the Martinez family, a young couple with 3 small children, Mrs. Martinez hugged me, crying, and said, "Mr. Dixon, this house is the dream of our entire lives. Our children will grow up here, knowing that honest work pays off." In that moment, with Spencer standing beside me, carrying his yellow hard hat and his hands full of cement, I understood that everything had been worth it. The 40 years of silent work, the feigned humiliations, the double life, the night I bought my son's house. It all led me to that moment where I finally had what I had always sought, a son who understood that true wealth is not in what you have, but in what you build for others. Last night, as we reviewed the blueprints for the second phase of the project, Spencer told me something that filled my heart. "Dad, I want my kids to grow up seeing their grandfather as the man who built half the town, but also as the man who never felt better than anyone else for having done it." And there is the most important lesson of this story. You can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have humility, you have nothing. You can live in the biggest house, drive the most expensive car, wear the finest clothes, but if you don't respect where you came from and who helped you get there, you are not rich. You are poor in spirit. We all have something to teach and something to learn. Sometimes the richest person in the place is the one who seems the least like it.